Have you ever walked into a room and realized for the first time that you were wrong? Not wrong because of what you said or a mistake you made, but because of the way you were standing or how loud you were breathing. I remember sitting in a silent library in Tokyo years ago. I thought I was being quiet. I thought I was blending in, but every time I moved my chair or unzipped my bag, I felt a dozen sets of eyes on me. It wasn't just noise. It was a friction between my default and their decorum. In that moment, I realized something uncomfortable. My personality, the thing I thought was uniquely mine, was actually a script. A script written by the city I grew up in, the schools I attended, and the dinner table I sat at. We like to think of our identity as a solid, unchanging stone, but in reality, we are more like water. We take the shape of the container we are poured into. If you grew up in a different zip code, would you even exist? Or would you be someone else entirely, wearing your face? Let's look at the invisible architecture that builds your soul. To understand how this happens, we have to look at the Big Five. In psychology, this is the gold standard for measuring personality. It's often remembered by the acronym OCEAN: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. For decades, we thought these traits were baked into our DNA. We assumed that if you were born extroverted, you'd be the life of the party anywhere. But then, researchers started taking these tests across borders. They found something fascinating. The average personality shifts by geography. Take extroversion, for example. In the United States, high extroversion is often seen as the ideal. It's the squeaky wheel getting the grease, the loud, assertive leader. But in many East Asian cultures, that same level of extroversion might be viewed differently. It isn't seen as leadership, it's seen as lack of restraint. This is known as the lexical hypothesis. It's the idea that our language creates the categories for our personality. If your culture doesn't have a word for assertive, do you ever truly become it? Or do you channel that energy into cooperation instead? Studies show that people in tight cultures, those with strict social norms, score higher in conscientiousness. They have to. Their survival depends on following the rules. Meanwhile, loose cultures with more freedom score higher in openness. You aren't just born with these scores. You are constantly calibrating them to fit the map you're standing on. Your personality isn't just a trait, it's a survival strategy. I want you to imagine a tiny coffee shop in the heart of Berlin. The air smells like burnt beans and rain. I'm standing in line, and the person in front of me is having an issue. They ordered an oat milk latte, but the barista gave them soy. In my head, I'm already scripting the polite way to handle this. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I think there might have been a mix-up." But the customer doesn't do that. They look at the barista in the eye and say, "This is soy. I ordered oat. Please fix it." No smile, no sorry, no softening the blow. To my American ears, it sounded like a declaration of war. I felt my heart rate spike. I felt embarrassed for them. But then I looked at the barista. They didn't look offended. They didn't look hurt. They just nodded, took the cup, and made the right drink. It was efficient. It was honest. It was German. In that moment, I realized my politeness wasn't just a personality trait. It was a trauma response to a culture that values face over fact. I was raised to believe that being nice was the same as being good. But in this room, being clear was the same as being respectful. My internal friction wasn't with the customer. It was with the invisible script I had been carrying in my pocket since birth. I was judging their character based on a rule book they weren't even playing by. How many times have you called someone rude or weak? when they were actually just following a different set of instructions. What we're really talking about here is a fundamental split in how the human brain perceives the self. In the 1990s, psychologists Hazel Markus and Shinobu Kitayama introduced a framework that changed everything. They divided the world into two main categories: independent and interdependent self-construals. If you grew up in an independent culture, like the US or Western Europe, your self is a bubble. You are defined by your unique traits, your private goals, and your internal abilities. You are you, regardless of who is in the room. But if you grew up in an interdependent culture, like many parts of Asia, Africa, or Latin America, the self is a knot in a net. You are defined by your relationships to others. You aren't just a person, you are a son, a daughter, a neighbor, an employee. In these cultures, personality isn't something you have, it's something you do in relation to others. This is why someone from an interdependent culture might seem inconsistent to a Westerner. They might be quiet and respectful with a boss, but loud and boisterous with friends. To a Westerner, that feels like faking it. But to them, that is the personality. It's the ability to harmonize with the environment. This is the self-reference effect in action. Our brains actually prioritize information differently based on these models. In independent cultures, the brain's medial prefrontal cortex lights up more for me than for mother. In interdependent cultures, the brain often treats me and mother with the same level of neural importance. Your culture hasn't just told you how to act. It has literally defined where you end and the rest of the world begins. I want to tell you about a friend of mine, Elena. Elena grew up in Mexico City but moved to Chicago in her 20s. She told me something once that I never forgot. In Spanish, she said, I am loud, I am funny, I'm the person who starts the dance floor. But in English, I am serious, I am careful, I am almost shy. She wasn't faking it in either language. She was experiencing a psychological phenomenon called cultural frame switching. It's the idea that our language isn't just a tool for communication. It's a lens that changes how we see ourselves. When Elena spoke Spanish, she stepped into a collectivist frame. The words she used were warmer, more connected, more rhythmic. When she switched to English, she stepped into an individualist frame. The language was more linear, more assertive, more focused on I and me. Maybe you felt this yourself if you speak more than one language. You feel your posture change, your sense of humor shifts. Even your memories feel different depending on which voice you're using to tell them. We like to think our true self stays the same no matter what. But Elena taught me that we are actually a collection of selves. And sometimes, all it takes is a change in vocabulary to unlock a version of you that you didn't even know existed. To understand why Elena feels like a different person in different cities, we have to look at the big picture. Psychologist Bronfenbrenner developed a model called ecological systems theory. Think of your life as a series of nesting dolls. At the center is you, with your biology and temperament. But the next layer out is your microsystem, your family, your friends, your immediate teachers. This is where you first learn the rules of being a person. But the layer that truly shapes your invisible script is the macrosystem. This is the outermost layer, the laws, the economy, and the cultural values of your nation. If your macro system is built on competition and capitalism, your personality will naturally lean toward achievement and self-promotion. You have to be that way to survive the system. But if your macro system is built on social safety and community responsibility, your personality might lean toward cooperation and stability. You aren't just a random collection of traits. You are a biological organism adapting to an ecological niche. We often blame ourselves for being anxious or competitive, But often, those aren't personal failures. They are simply the logical responses to the macro system we live in. The system demands a certain version of you, and over time, you become it. I remember a night in a small village in the mountains of Peru. I was staying with a family that had lived in the same valley for generations. At dinner, I did what I always do. I finished my plate quickly and started checking my phone. I was productive. I was on to the next thing. The father of the family looked at me, not with anger, but with a kind of deep pity. "In your world," he said, "you are always running to a place that doesn't exist." In his world, the self wasn't something you optimized or upgraded. It was something you shared, slowly, over a meal that lasted 3 hours. In that moment, I felt the invisible script of my own culture start to crack. I realized that my ambition and my restlessness weren't just who I was. They were side effects of a world that taught me my value was tied to my speed. It's a strange feeling when you realize your personality is actually a costume. You start to wonder, if I take off the speed and the competition and the politeness, who is the person underneath the fabric? Maybe you've had a moment like that, on a long trip or after a big life change. That moment where the you everyone expects suddenly feels like a stranger. It's terrifying, but it's also the first time you are actually free. Because once you see the script, you realize you didn't actually write it. And if you didn't write it, you don't have to follow it to the letter. We often talk about culture as if it's just a set of ideas in our heads, but modern neuroscience shows us that culture is actually physical. It is rooted into the folding of your brain through a process called cultural neuroscience. Every time you repeat a cultural habit, you are strengthening a neural pathway. If you live in a culture that prizes individualism, your brain gets very good at analytical thinking. You become an expert at looking at an object in isolation, focusing on its specific traits. But if you live in a collectivist culture, your brain develops a preference for holistic thinking. You aren't looking at the object, you are looking at the relationship between the object and its background. Researchers have used fMRI scans to prove this. When shown a picture of a person with a facial expression, Western brains focus almost entirely on the face. East Asian brains, however, show significantly more activity when scanning the people in the background. Their brains are literally wired to scan for social context before they even see the individual. This is neuroplasticity at its most profound level. Your culture has spent years acting as a sculptor, chiseling away at your synapses. The way you perceive fairness, time, or even beauty isn't just an opinion, it is a biological reflex. You don't just have a culture, your brain is the culture. So where does that leave you? If your traits are a map, and your brain is a sculptor, and your language is a lens, is there anything left that's actually original? I like to think of identity not as a single stone, but as a mosaic. Some of the tiles were given to you by your parents, some were pressed into place by the city you live in, and some were shaped by the hardships you didn't choose. But here's the secret. You are the one holding the grout. You are the one who decides how these pieces fit together. Maybe you're a German level of honest, but with a Latin level of warmth. Maybe you have an American ambition, but a Japanese sense of silence. The goal of psychology isn't to strip away your culture to find a pure self. That self doesn't exist. We're social animals. The goal is to become a conscious architect of your own script, to look at a habit and ask, is this me, or is this just where I live? And once you know the difference, you can start to choose. You can stop running to a place that doesn't exist, and you can finally start living in the one where you actually are.